turn to Kevin Smith for an update on cybersecurity.
Hi, good afternoon. So I was here last PMR in April, and we thought it was very important to have a follow-up with cybersecurity. So I'm going to have a complement to the previous presentation to go in a little bit more detail. There has been some conversations in the public about security and what the census is doing to secure data, and I want to stress that protection of the data we collect is the census's highest priority. And I'm going to describe that it's not just the technology, but it's the people and the processes we also use within our culture that we go through to help make sure everyone's aware of the importance of the data and takes action to protect it. And I'm then going to go into and describe a little bit more about what we're doing in cybersecurity. So on the first slide from data stewardship, it's our formal process to basically protect data. This is not just something within technology. This is something within every one of the employees who comes to work for the census and contractors. We realize our ability to store and save and protect the data is a team effort. And this has to do with information security, protecting the confidentiality and privacy, and continually doing that and validating with each of us how to go through and do those things. And it's not just words, there's a comprehensive framework behind it that we follow and we practice on a daily basis. On the next slide about our overall approach, and as I said, the census culture values data security. And so within phase one, we continually are creating and reinforcing our culture. We continually educate our staff of what our obligations are to protect data. We check and we validate this, and we enforce it. And there are laws and policies around this that we follow as census employees and contractors to move through the cycle. When we look at implementing a system, and I'm going to go into some of the details, but we have collaborated across the federal governments with partners in the government as well as within the industry to make sure we're putting the best things forward to secure the data from a technology aspect. We're also coordinating across the federal government and industry using the standard cybersecurity framework. This is about how you properly identify issues in security, you protect against them, you continually review with solutions to detect if an issue is happening, and ultimately how you respond and recover as quickly as possible from those events with the least amount of risk to the data. We follow these processes, and this is something I described in the last PMR that takes a lot of coordination across the government, but it's something we do, and we test, and we continually go through the process to make sure we're engaged in the right fashion to facilitate that. The two places I'm going to talk about really in more depth today is about what have we done to design solutions that are helping us contain cyber threats as soon as they're detected, sustain the services that ultimately maintains the public trust we're looking for from the census aspect. This is something key that I talked at a high level about in the last PMR that I did not go into more detail. The other piece is from the monitoring aspect. What are the standard and best practices we're implementing within solutions to continually detect when threats occur, and what are we doing to protect against them? This is another area I'm going to describe a little bit more in detail. But ultimately what we're also doing is in phase 3 when we're securing the data and collection. This is something that's been said for many years. We are absolutely using data security for encryption everywhere we're collecting the data. So we're encrypting data in transit as it's going from your computer as a respondent into the census, and we're encrypting it within the census as the data is at rest on all the places we store it. This is something that doesn't just rely on perimeter defenses in networking, it relies on protecting the data, and I'm assuring you that the data is encrypted. Moving through as well, which I'm going to describe quickly, is that we don't just encrypt the data and protect it. We're using a strategy to isolate the data away from the public internet as quickly as possible once the data is submitted. This is key in the design for what the enumeration devices do, as well as for internet self-response does. And as we go through as well, we're continually going through processes after we securely receive the data, get it, isolate it, to validate it. And we're validating that with people and processes and technology that looks at all the transactions and goes through that validation process, which is something the census has been doing for years now. And we also go through an aspect as we're going to go through the process of gathering the data, we're going to also go through and protect your confidentiality using concepts such as differential privacy. And as phase 4 talks about, ultimately we have to continually monitor and respond what we're doing. We have to always test and monitor what we're doing, and it's not just the technology, it's the processes we follow. We also have to make sure we're continually having the right level of communication with the public about what we're doing through a communications campaign. These are the things we're doing overall from a stewardship aspect of data to protect it with not just technology, but people and communications and processes going forward. So on slide 4, slide 13. This was something I talked about at the last PMR. I've also, so we're aware, I have been speaking at the Census National Advisory Committees. I've been speaking at the Census Scientific Advisory Committees, gathering feedback, working with our partners in those groups as we share data. Also within the engagement of a lot of this data as we go through from the partnerships to understand and manage threats. At a public level, it's standard to only share what we're doing and describe that. It is not standard or best practice in security to share things like what are your solutions, what are the protocols you're following, what exactly are you using for technology. That's kind of putting the playbook out there when you don't want people to see the playbook. I want to assure the team that the playbook is shared within the federal government. The playbook is shared within the federal intelligence community that we work with in the federal government. It's been shared with the federal CIO staff within OMB. It's been shared with oversight committees, assisting us and guiding us through moving things forward to ensure the protection of your data. And it's also shared with our industry partners that we work with on a daily basis to ensure the protection. It is not necessarily something you describe in a public level, but I'm going to do my best in describing some of these solutions as we go to help try to at least put some more context behind what we're doing. Something that I want to put out, and that's where the bullet is at the bottom, the sharing detailed solutions and systems and processes. I mean, we're engaged with the cyber experts across the federal government and private industry to help us get there. And part of what I want to describe is something simple in security that is the 95%, 5% conversation or kind of rule. The typical thing we say in security is, if it's already happened and someone has already figured out how it's a cyber threat, it's in the 95% of the known universe of things that can be affecting you. Typically what happens is the industry solutions which we use know what those 95% of the threats are. They already look for them, they already detect them, and they kind of block them before they happen. So once someone's already done it, industry knows about it, puts it into their product sets, and we are then covered and protected from the known things people do. Not many things happen or have a problem from protecting yourself against the known things. It's really that 5% of the cyberspace that's unknown. And I want to stress the importance of being within the federal government and a bureau within the federal government offers us an ability to tap into that 5% unknown space, which is extremely valuable for us. The unknown space are things that are happening, or things that might be suspected from other areas of the world. This is where the federal intelligence community comes in, where they can proactively let us know what things are happening within their realm of tools and resources that typical industry does not know. We are directly connected into tapping into this resource to proactively get in front of potential cyber threats that are not known in the general industry. This is a very, very important concept to go through that's an extreme benefit to us from being in the federal government. So on the next slide, I wanted to say that this is something that I broke into and stated at the last PMR as a summary. I use that opportunity to basically state there are many, many different threats that we could face within the census, and instead of the list of cyber threats being in the hundreds, it's easier to talk about them in these 7 high-level category threat areas because they really do resolve back to this. And in the last PMR, I talked about the fact that with external threats, from the end user perspective, the respondent working into the census, a lot of what we have to do is rely on the industry and other federal agencies to help provide services to help us resolve these threats, because there's not a lot of things within the census's direct control until you get into our website and respond to our information. I describe this at a high level, the next slides are going to go into some details and descriptions that I will slow down on it, but I wanted to make sure from this aspect, just generally describe what each one of these are, and then get into some of the descriptions of solutions. So compromising a respondent device. Every one of us is going to respond to the census, and every one of us is going to use one of our personal devices possibly, or you could use a government or a corporate device, but you're going to log into a website, hopefully, and you're going to basically respond to the census. I, as the census CIO, am not able to protect your personal device. What I am able to do is make sure once you get to us in a website that that is protected. So I'll go through the descriptions of those. But there's a point where when you have your device, we'll go through and try to educate you, and this is where we talk about relying on industry and other federal agencies. We'll try to go through an education program to inform you of what to do to protect yourself, but we can assure you when you connect to us, you're protected. When you go through compromising the external network access, that's talking about the telecommunications firms of the world who help route the internet in the US. We have to make sure that when you say you're going to the census, you're getting to us. Impersonation of the census talks about rogue websites and phishing attempts to try to get you as the public to go to the wrong website. There are things we're doing to take care of that and mitigate against that. Invalid responses, if someone's using the sites properly and the data we receive is secure, what are we doing to make sure that the response is valid and the type of response we want? I'll go through some solutions in the next slides of what we're doing. All of those are external to the census. We can detect some of them, but we can't directly respond to some of these as threats. The core that people typically talk about, and these are the cores that are within the public conversations as well, but what are we doing to make sure that no one's disrupting our internet self-response site or breaching the data, taking it or changing it? There are things that happen, the word's out there, generally distributed denial of service attacks, which is really computer-generated traffic to try to make the system break. Data breaches are people going through brute force, which means just trying to plug through technically and break through as many holes as they can to get into the technology. They also would use phishing. They also would try to compromise insider threat to get the data and or change the data. The other piece is compromising employee devices. So the general furnished equipment of the government furnished equipment, our laptops, our desktops, as well as the devices we're giving enumerators and employees in the field. There are things that those could be compromised. And so this is the general layout of from a respondent's view from the top, how would they come into the census, and the compromising employee devices is how we're gathering data on the back end. That just generally describes the 7 threat areas. On the next slide is going to be me describing what we're doing at each one. I'll try to, oh, actually, not yet, sorry. No, you can go to the next slide. The next slide's important, I apologize. There are 2 things that have to happen here to make sure that we do this appropriately. And I'm gonna say that it's not just technology and tools to see things and react, it's also specific things you do and how you design a system. And so we've designed our systems to contain threats and sustain the services in order to maintain public trust. And this is part of what we've been saying, or I've been saying from the beginning. The census's design is first focused on securing the data from you as a respondent. Second, our second priority is making sure that the user experience, your interaction with the census and the internet self-response doesn't suffer dramatically by doing security. So to the left, I described this picture in general sense in the last PMR, and what it basically stated in the last PMR was, you can have an immense amount of security embedded within an application to protect the data, but at the same time, the user experience may suffer. These are opposing forces. It could become slower, burdensome to use. I will say confidently that using the cloud infrastructure to support our systems enables us to do some things that creates a better balance of security and end user performance based on our specific design criteria to basically contain issues and sustain services. What this is doing is actually going back to some typical concepts. If I had to describe it, not state it, we're going back to what physical security is. When everyone entered this building today, there were some layers. There's a physical entry point with an appropriate level of security for you to gain access to this building. There were doors you had to go through and walls that are surrounding you to make sure you're going into the right place and you get in and you're in the right location first. The layers are the different gates and rooms you had to go through to get here. It's a typical physical security practice. There are other places where possibly there are isolations where you separate different rooms. You basically have lines and guards in place to put some people in one room, a next set of people in the next room, and people are watching the lines. Guards are watching. And if they see something they don't like, they contain that room and they close it off. So the issue is isolated to one location. But everyone else who's in a different line or a different room is not affected by this. Ultimately, once your information is submitted to the census, just like on the enumeration devices, which I'll describe in a second, it is locked down behind closed doors. It is vaulted and it's put into a safe that is not accessible outside into the public. It's not even visible, all right? So this is a standard practice in industry that they achieve and they strive for, that we are striving and achieving for the same thing, because it's best practice design. And I'll say that the way that it's being done is based on having the right visibility to see when an issue happens, take immediate action to contain it, and knowing that the design itself allows the internet self-response or allows enumeration services technically to continue. So on the next slide, these are the words of description that I used as a voiceover in the last PMR, and I've used this as a voiceover in the other forums I've been in. And as I've said too, this data has been shared in depth. I did not go back to say this, but so I have as well, in 2016 and 17, we've been through federal cyber stats with the federal CIO and their support staff, who we go through the details of what we're trying to do. We've had roundtables with industry and members of oversight to go through this information on an off-public forum. We've had hearings that have discussed some of these topics. This current year, in the public domain, we've discussed in both the National Advisory Committee and the Census Scientific Advisory Committee these topics, gained feedback. And this is, I did the PMR in April 2018 as well as today. But we're continuing these conversations in depth with all of our federal partners in industry. So these are things that there's much beneath this that is shared with the industry experts and federal experts to continue to make sure the right things are being done. So from compromising a respondent device, we are storing minimal data on the device. What I mean by that is that the census is not storing any data on your respondent device, your computer or your mobile phone, to go collect data or to submit data to the internet self-response tool. If you choose as a respondent on your device to store data locally or cache it, there's not much I can do to stop you from caching that data. We will go through a public campaign and we'll go through some communications to let you know the dangers of doing that in some of these responses. But that's up to you with the way you use your internet browser and how you want to connect to the rest of the internet. I will say that once you connect to the internet self-response site, all of the communications between your device and our website is 100% encrypted in that transmission from you to us. Can't be seen, can't be taken. The data is already packaged in an envelope and it cannot be read. From compromising the external network access, we are proactively monitoring our site performance and activity. We're also going to go through and look for unauthorized connection attempts. But we're going to need, and we are going to work with the industry to make sure if you are being routed to the right website. Is that in the industry, or is that because there's a rogue website that you're being directed to? What we do not want to have happen is you are supposed to be going to the census site, and for some reason a large industry player who's a telecommunications firm somehow had a breach and is being routed to the wrong place. Those are the things we're talking about in solutions we have to go through, working with industry. Impersonation of the census. We are proactively identifying rogue websites. A rogue website is basically a fake website of the census. So we have already, within the communications organization of Census, purchased many website names, domains, that people could use, would use, that look like the census. But ultimately, someone may come up with a website and try to point you at that website. We have services that proactively scan and look across the internet and detect these rogue websites, and there are federal processes we follow through once they're identified to go through the federal government to go through the closure of those websites. But ultimately, as I said before, this is an external threat. We will proactively communicate this as soon as possible when we see these events to educate the public. But we're not necessarily in direct control as the census to shut down a website. But we're gonna let people know if this happens, and we're gonna do it as quickly as possible. Invalid response. We have an automated analysis of our individual responses. As responses come in, we have systems that are looking at social media and looking at other places to determine, is this an accurate response or should we flag this for further follow-up? This is where people and processes come in. We will be flagging and tagging some of these responses that come in and looking at them to determine, what do we think? Is it irregular or not? This is something that's been done in past censuses when it was paper as well. We're going to be looking at the analysis of these irregularities and taking action. And we'll also be looking at data flow analysis. Is too much data coming in from one place or not? That looks weird. You know, there's things we're going to be watching to make sure that the data matches our expectations as it's coming in. But ultimately, this is a process that has to be followed with people and eyes on it to validate the responses. So on the next slide. So these are things that are internal threats to the census. This is things where I'm going to describe the solutions, technologies, and protocols, but we're not going to be talking in further about them. Our partners know about them and we're working with them, but in a public forum, disruption to the internet self-response site. Well, we're monitoring for traffic spikes and we'll be able to take action in those. I'll say that based on the solution design I described, we'll be able to sustain services. If we're monitoring for traffic spikes and we can continually grow the system to make sure it's always working, we have a complement and a mitigation to this. Proactive identification of malicious traffic and robots, where we're going to be using all of the technology within our telecommunication providers that directly connect to us. They have DDoS services that detect these things. We will be having things that ask you up front, are you a robot or not? These are things called CAPTCHA. They're known standards. These are just standard things to do. All of these things are in place to mitigate against just a typical automated attack. We're also going to be working, as I said, with the Cyber Threat Intelligence Group. They're going to be looking at, is someone going to be coming at you? Did they see that someone's going to come at us? Did we see in social media that someone's trying to come at us? Sometimes being ahead of the game is the best attack and approach. So the more that we can know about this unknown area of threats, things that we may not see initially, but someone else has their eyes on it and focus, the better off we will be. I already mentioned on the other one, the other bullet, the design to sustain self-response services. That's key. We have an ability to continually sustain the services based on the design, which can mitigate some of these as well. And I did say the last bullet as well. There are distributed denial of service protections from telecommunications providers, as well as from our website. We have solutions in place to offload the initial attack of our website to an industry leader who does this on a daily basis. And they will be the first line of defense before they filter out the robots and the problems and the things, and then they come to us to handle. So we have many layers of solutions in place to funnel in the non-wanted traffic into what we want to come to our website. Data breaches is the big area. I want to describe that data breaches to the census is not just the risk of someone taking data from the census, it's also the risk of someone going through a non-natural path, an unexpected path. We expect people to follow the internet self-response site. We expect them to enter in their data through our website and submit it. We don't want people to come into the site and change the data without going through the natural flow of the system we want. We will be watching for that and detecting it. So we'll be, at the same time, monitoring for unauthorized access. That's what that was speaking about. We will be making sure you're supposed to be going through the site the right way to put data in. If we see something we don't like, we immediately contain it. Immediately, no questions asked. We monitor for irregular data flows. If we see data flowing the wrong way or in an irregular pattern we don't like, we will contain it and we will find out later what's going on. The sustain of the services will allow us to continue to allow people to respond, and our ability to contain the issue means data will not be affected. We have protected it. Also in this case, some data breaches. Encryption of data in transit and at rest. This is the best practices that we of the census have followed with all of our data, not just for 2020 data for the 2020 census. The data sitting inside of the networks when you respond is encrypted. And then I also said it's locked in a vault even after you submit it. So it's taken off the internet very quickly. We continually go through system application and penetration testing with industry leaders as well as the federal government. We have already, last year we had industry leaders go through and do a penetration test, which means try to technically break in with brute force into the internet self-response site last year and this year. This year we had the federal government, Department of Homeland Security, go through penetration testing of not just our internet self-response site, trying to break in into the enumeration solutions that are on the cell phones, into the address listing and mapping applications that will list the US, into all of the devices and solutions to collect data for the 2020 census. No critical or high findings were found in this, both from the industry and well as from DHS. And we're continually going through and securing the solution if we found some things that are at a level we need to correct. But nothing major was discovered. No data was able to be taken because of the design and the way to go through and do things, and because of the diligence of the processes we follow to continually keep systems up to date. System security management monitoring analytics. In summary, we have all of the tools you would have to monitor what is happening on each server, what is happening on each application, what looks irregular, what looks right. That is the 95% solutions. The industry solutions that know 95% of the issues are watching for all of these things. We have those in place. We're also taking those and looking for taking those tools and not just looking for the 95% stuff. We're taking those tools to then show us where there's an irregular data flow. Show us where we don't like to see, where something's happening we may not like to technically see. Look to identify a pattern we don't like. We're using those tools to identify that. Timely patch management. When we identify that there's an issue, we continually are scanning the technology. This is typical practice. You scan a system in the technical configuration, and if something pops up that says the configuration needs to change, we change it. So these are things that are identified through a process of continually making sure your technology is configured the right way. This is done not just by the census, but the Department of Homeland Security scans all of our publicly addressable systems and complements this as well. So we have transparency and accountability outside of just the census looking for this. It is also the federal government. Continual cyber awareness training. This is the connection to the culture of the census. We are continuously going through and educating our employees with a battery of things, which is kind of in the compromised employee devices, phishing attacks, attempts. Everyone in the census, contracting, as well as employees, knows the value of our data and knows that their responsibilities exist for stewardship. This is important because technology alone can stop so much, but people seeing something and saying something, and that's someone else's tagline, it's important. In security, sometimes that's what you need, and the quicker and more comfortable employees feel that they can do that, the better off you will always be. That's embedded and ingrained in the way we operate on a daily basis here at the census. And the other thing here is continue, as you can see, we're gonna have a proactive outreach and awareness campaign. We're gonna let people know what we're doing and why and how it relates to them. I'll let you know that the design we have to contain the issues means data's not gonna go anywhere. We're gonna have a handle on that. And so in the outreach and awareness, it's making people feel comfortable with that and move forward with that from a design aspect. So the last section, been long going through this, is the compromising employee devices. So not just the laptops and desktops of census employees and contractors. What are we doing for all the devices we're handing out to enumerators who are for a part-time basis collecting data for the census? Well, data is encrypted in transit and at rest on those devices. So from a cell phone aspect of enumeration, this device, data is encrypted on it, and it's also encrypted when it's transferred back to the census. If something happens on this device we don't like, because we're watching it, we can remotely wipe it, and we can clean all the data and all the systems and all the technology off of it. One key thing that is not mentioned here that I would like to state again is that the key design factor here in the enumeration tools is similar to the design factor in the internet self-response tool. Once the enumerator collects the data on the device and hits submit, the data is off the device. It is gone, it is removed, it is locked away in a vault inside of the census. So the exposure of data on this phone is minimal because there's not gonna be a lot of data on this phone. It's gonna remove itself as soon as it's connected to the network. And as we said here, we're monitoring the activity on this phone. We're using two-factor authentication into the devices. And we're also going through a complement of phishing tests within the organization to make sure people know what they're supposed to do. But the devices in enumeration are restricted to just specific areas they can go. They're not logging into the network of census, which means they do not have access to the data of the census. They are simply an input submission device, and it manages their workload. The data on that is removed quickly and not a threat to the overall, the overall confidence of what we're doing to protect the data, because it's the data itself is not on the phone. So a lot of the two-factor authentication and mechanisms that were discussed previously were, what are you doing to protect the data? Well, those are all things that are standard practice in any census employee logging into any federal network. There is a distinction of if you're logging into a federal network or not. And so I wanted to make that clear as my last point. And so from the standpoint of my summary, Mr. Fontenot, I'm done. I guess now, yeah, I am open for questions, and I'll do my best to that.
Hi, Marianne Bellotti, Department of Commerce. I'm curious about the identification of rogue websites. Is it part of your plan to share that data from DNS monitoring with industry partners so they can stop the spread of such campaigns on their own platforms?
Our intent today, so we have a service to monitor for the rogue websites. Our intent is to share that data with our partners we're working with. But as known in technology, stopping it sometimes is difficult. We will look at engaging industry to see what they can do to block the access to these, but it's a harder problem than you would think to resolve. And that's why we think a lot of it as an approach of communicating quickly is a quicker path than attempting to technically block some of this. This is a difficult problem.
Other questions? If not, thank you very much, Kevin. We appreciate it.